My mom said, "Your brother needs the house more than you do, so sign it over." So I told her. I already spoke to the lawyer about that, and her face told me she knew why. I knew something was wrong when my mom stopped asking me to come over and started telling me when I needed to come over. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at my desk trying to finish a report before the end of my shift. She called twice in about 10 minutes. I ignored the first call because I was working. When she called again, I stepped into the hallway and answered. She sounded unusually calm. She told me she needed me to come by the house that evening because there was something important we needed to discuss about the property. That was how she put it. The property, not my house, not the house I had bought, just the property. I remember standing there with my back against the wall and looking at the fluorescent lights above me because I suddenly felt like I was missing something obvious. I asked her what had happened. She said nothing had happened. That answer bothered me more than if she had told me there was an emergency. My mom only used that tone when she had already decided something and was trying to make the decision sound like it had happened naturally. I told her I would come after work. She said I needed to bring my mortgage paperwork. That was the first moment I became genuinely suspicious. I had never told her I kept my mortgage documents at home. She knew I owned the house, obviously. She had been there plenty of times, but there was no reason for her to suddenly need my paperwork. I asked why. She said we could talk about it when I got there. Then she hung up. I stared at my phone for a few seconds. My first thought was that my younger brother, Ryan, had gotten himself into another financial mess. That wasn't even an accusation. It was just the pattern we had all gotten used to. Ryan was 31 at the time. He had a job that seemed to change every year. He had accumulated credit card debt. He had financed a truck he couldn't comfortably afford. He had moved apartments twice in less than 18 months. He had a habit of starting something with a lot of confidence and then expecting somebody else to help when the numbers stopped working. Usually that somebody was my mom. Sometimes it was my dad. Occasionally it was me. I had spent years trying not to become the person everyone called when Ryan needed rescuing. I wasn't always successful. My mom had always treated the difference between Ryan and me as though it were some kind of moral obligation. I was the responsible one. Ryan was the one who needed support. That meant I was supposed to understand when he got more help. I was supposed to be patient when plans changed around him. I was supposed to accept that he had made mistakes because everyone makes mistakes. I used to think that was normal family stuff. It took me a long time to realize that being understanding and being expected to absorb the consequences of someone else's choices were two very different things. The house was the biggest example. I had bought it about 7 years earlier. It wasn't some huge place. It was a 3-bedroom house in an ordinary neighborhood with a small backyard, an attached garage, and a mortgage that had been manageable when I bought it. I had put down a decent amount of money. I had worked overtime for nearly 2 years to build up the down payment. I had skipped vacations. I drove an older car. I fixed things myself when I could. I wasn't rich. I just had one thing that was finally mine. The house had also become more valuable over the years. I didn't pay much attention to that at first. I cared more about keeping the roof from leaking and making sure the furnace didn't die in the middle of winter. But my mom had started making comments about the house about 2 years before this happened. Nothing direct. She would mention how much houses were selling for. She would ask whether I had refinanced. She would ask how much I still owed. Once, while we were eating Thanksgiving dinner, she casually asked whether I had considered moving somewhere smaller. I laughed because I assumed she was joking. I was 34. I wasn't exactly living in a mansion, but she had looked at me very seriously and said that I didn't need all that space. I didn't think much of it at the time. Looking back, I think that was the first warning I ignored. That evening, I left work and drove to my parents' house. Ryan's truck was parked outside. That made me slow down before I pulled into the driveway. My mom had said we needed to discuss the property. Ryan was there. That wasn't a coincidence. I sat in my car for a minute before going inside. I remember thinking I was probably making too much of it. Maybe Ryan had found a new job. Maybe they wanted to ask me for a loan. Maybe something had happened with my dad. Maybe there was a family issue involving the house I simply didn't understand. I kept coming up with explanations because the obvious one felt too ridiculous. When I walked inside, my parents were sitting at the dining room table. Ryan was there too. There were papers spread across the table. My mom had a folder in front of her. My dad looked uncomfortable. Ryan wouldn't look at me. That was when I knew this wasn't going to be a normal family conversation. My mom motioned for me to sit down. I asked what was going on. She explained that Ryan had been struggling financially and needed a stable place to live. That part wasn't surprising. What surprised me was what came next. She said that since I was doing well and already had equity in my house, I should consider transferring the house to Ryan. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood her. I asked if she meant selling it to him. She said no. She meant signing it over. She explained that Ryan could take over the mortgage payments. I told her that wasn't how mortgages worked. She said we could figure that out. I asked why I would give him a house worth several $100,000 when I still had a mortgage on it. My mom became frustrated. She said I was focusing on technicalities instead of family. That phrase had always been her way of ending an argument. If she could turn a financial question into a test of whether I loved my family, she usually won. This time it didn't work. I looked at my dad. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at Ryan. He finally looked up. He seemed embarrassed. For a second, I felt sorry for him. Then he said that he wasn't asking for the house. He said Mom had suggested it. That made the room go quiet. My mom immediately said that Ryan needed somewhere stable and that I had other options. I asked what other options she meant. She said I could rent an apartment. I reminded her that I had spent years paying the mortgage. She said I could use the equity from selling it. I asked how I was supposed to sell it if I gave it away. She became irritated again. Then she said the sentence that I still remember almost word for word. She said my brother needed the house more than I did, so I should sign it over. I looked at her. I didn't yell. I didn't insult Ryan. I didn't even argue. I just told her that I had already spoken to a lawyer about that. Her face changed immediately. It was subtle. Her shoulders stiffened. Her mouth opened slightly. Then she looked at my dad, then at Ryan. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I saw it, and her face told me she knew exactly why. The strange part was that I hadn't actually told her what the lawyer had said. I hadn't even known there was a problem until 3 days earlier. That was when I realized this wasn't simply about Ryan needing a place to live. There was something else. 3 days before that dinner, I had gotten an envelope from a law office. I almost threw it away because I thought it was junk mail. My name was printed on the outside. The return address was from a law firm I recognized. It belonged to an attorney named Mark who had helped me with a property issue a few years earlier. I hadn't spoken to him in a long time. Inside was a short letter asking me to contact the office regarding a matter involving my property records. It didn't explain much. I called the next morning. The receptionist told me Mark could see me that afternoon. I assumed there had been some clerical mistake. Instead, Mark told me that a document had recently been presented to his office that concerned my house. He asked whether I had signed anything recently. I said no. He asked whether I had authorized anyone to sign anything on my behalf. I said absolutely not. Then he asked me whether my parents had ever helped me with the purchase of the house. I told him they had helped me with part of the closing costs. That was true. When I bought the house, my parents had given me $18,000. It wasn't a loan. We had discussed it at the time. They called it help with the down payment. I had a copy of the paperwork showing it was a gift. Mark asked whether there had been any discussion that the money gave them an ownership interest in the house. I said no. He looked at me for a moment. Then he asked whether I had ever signed a power of attorney involving the property. I said no. He told me that a document had been brought to his office that appeared to suggest otherwise. That was the moment my stomach dropped. He wouldn't give me every detail because he wanted to verify the document first. But he told me not to sign anything. He told me not to give anyone copies of my mortgage documents. He told me to gather every document I had related to the house, including the purchase paperwork, mortgage statements, insurance records, property tax records, and anything my parents had ever signed regarding the money they gave me. I asked whether he thought someone was trying to take my house. He said he didn't want to speculate until he had reviewed everything. That answer scared me more than if he had said yes. I spent that evening going through a filing cabinet. I found the original closing documents. I found the gift letter from my parents. I found old mortgage statements. I found property tax records. I found homeowners' insurance documents. I found receipts for repairs. I found emails from the time I bought the house. I also found something I had completely forgotten about. It was an old text conversation between my mom and me from shortly after I bought the house. She had asked whether I was planning to put her name on anything. I had said no because the mortgage and deed were in my name. She had replied that she understood. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I sent the documents to Mark. The next day he called. He told me the deed was still in my name. That was the first thing he wanted me to know. The second thing was that there was no valid transfer of ownership. The third thing was more complicated. Someone had apparently been asking questions about transferring the property. He couldn't tell me exactly who had made the inquiries until he had more information. He advised me not to confront anyone until we understood what was happening. I agreed. That was why, when my mom told me to sign the house over to Ryan, I already knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how far it went. After I told her I had spoken to a lawyer, the conversation at the table changed completely. My mom stopped pushing the idea. Instead, she asked what lawyer. I said it was someone who had helped me with the property before. She asked what I had told him. I said I hadn't told him anything about this conversation because I hadn't known about it until that night. That made her even more uncomfortable. Ryan looked confused. My dad finally spoke. He said we should all calm down. I agreed. Then I asked why there were documents on the table. My mom gathered them quickly. I asked what they were. She said they were just information about transferring property. I asked where she got them. She said she had been researching. I asked why she had been researching how to transfer my house to Ryan. She didn't answer directly. She said she was trying to help her son. I told her I understood wanting to help Ryan. I just didn't understand why helping him required giving away something I owned. She said I was making it sound worse than it was. Ryan finally admitted that he had been talking to Mom about moving into my house. That was the first thing that actually hurt. I had thought he didn't know. I asked him how long. He said a few weeks. I asked whether he had ever spoken to me about it. He said no. He explained that he thought Mom was handling it. I asked what he thought was going to happen. He said he thought I might let him rent it cheaply. That was different. If he had asked me directly about renting the house, I probably would have considered it. I wasn't interested in putting him on the street. But apparently my mom had taken that possibility and turned it into a plan for him to own the house. I told Ryan that I wasn't angry at him for needing help. I was angry that nobody had asked me. My mom said that if I really cared about my brother, I would have offered the house without being asked. That sentence stayed with me, because I realized she had created a situation where any answer other than yes could be presented as cruelty. If I gave him the house, I was a good brother. If I refused, I was selfish. If I offered to help him rent it, I was apparently still selfish because I wasn't giving him enough. I left that night without agreeing to anything. On the drive home, I kept thinking about my mom's expression when I mentioned the lawyer. It bothered me more than the argument. She hadn't looked surprised that I had spoken to a lawyer. She had looked worried that I had spoken to the right lawyer. The next morning, I called Mark again. I told him about the dinner. I told him exactly what my mom had said. He asked whether she had access to any of my property documents. I said I didn't think so. Then I remembered something. About 6 months earlier, my mom had helped me clean out my garage while I was recovering from a bad flu. There had been a box of old paperwork sitting near the workbench. I had left it there because I was planning to organize it later. I remembered my mom carrying the box into the house. I had thanked her. I didn't remember taking it back out. I went into my office and looked through the cabinet. The box wasn't there. I checked the garage. It wasn't there either. My heart started beating faster. I called my mom. I tried to sound casual. I asked whether she still had the box of old paperwork from my garage. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I asked about the box with my house documents. She paused. Then she said she might have taken some papers home because she thought I didn't need them. I asked her to bring them back. She said she would look. That was when I stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt, not completely. I still didn't believe she was trying to steal my house. I thought there had to be some explanation. Maybe she had misunderstood something. Maybe she believed the gift money had given my parents some right to the property. Maybe Ryan had pressured her. Maybe she had gotten bad legal advice. I wanted one of those explanations to be true. Unfortunately, the documents started making that harder. Mark asked me to request a copy of the current property records from the county office. I went during my lunch break. The clerk gave me the records I requested. The deed showed me as the owner. The mortgage was in my name. There was no transfer. There was no legitimate lien from my parents. There was nothing that gave Ryan any ownership, but there was a recent document in the file that I hadn't seen before. It was a notice related to a proposed transaction. It hadn't changed ownership. It was more like a preliminary filing. Still, my name was on it, and I had never authorized it. I took a copy to Mark. He looked through it carefully. Then he asked me something I hadn't considered. He asked whether my mother had ever had access to my driver's license or social security number. I said she probably knew my social security number because she had helped me with taxes years ago. I suddenly felt sick. I had trusted my family with things I wouldn't have trusted a stranger with. That night I checked my credit report. There were no new accounts. There were no new loans. There was nothing immediately alarming. But I changed my passwords anyway. I froze my credit. I contacted my mortgage company. I told them I was not authorizing any transfer of ownership or modification involving another person. They added a note to my account. I contacted my homeowner's insurance company too. I felt ridiculous making those calls. Part of me still believed I was overreacting. But every time I started feeling stupid, I remembered the missing documents. A week later, my mom came over with a folder. She put it on my kitchen counter. She said she had found some of the papers. I opened it. Some were mine, some weren't. The gift letter was there. The mortgage paperwork was there. There was also a printed email from my mom to someone I didn't recognize. I asked who the person was. She said it was someone who had been helping her understand the property situation. I asked whether it was a lawyer. She said not exactly. I asked whether I could see the rest of the emails. She said no. That answer told me more than anything else. I didn't accuse her of fraud, I didn't threaten her. I just told her I needed her to stop discussing my property with anyone. She became emotional. She said I was treating her like a criminal. I told her I wasn't. I said I was trying to protect myself because I didn't understand what had happened. She said she was only trying to make sure Ryan had a future. I asked why Ryan's future depended on my house. She said because I was the one child who could afford to sacrifice something. That was probably the most honest explanation she ever gave me. It wasn't about what was legally fair. It wasn't even about what was practical. She believed that because I had been responsible, I owed everyone the benefits of my responsibility. I told her I couldn't do that. She left angry. For about 2 weeks, things were quiet. I thought maybe it was over. I was wrong. One Friday afternoon, I received a letter from a title company. They were asking me to verify information regarding a proposed property transaction. I immediately called Mark. He told me not to respond directly. He contacted them. A few days later, he explained what had happened. Someone had apparently provided the title company with paperwork suggesting that my parents had an interest in the property and that I was willing to transfer it to Ryan. The paperwork wasn't sufficient to transfer ownership, but someone had gone through enough trouble to make the idea look legitimate. Mark couldn't prove who had submitted every document yet, but he told me that my mother had been in contact with the company. That was when I finally understood why her face had changed when I mentioned the lawyer. She knew there was paperwork moving around. She knew I didn't until I got that letter. I confronted her carefully. I asked whether she had contacted the title company. She admitted she had. She said she had only asked questions. I asked why paperwork had been submitted. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I asked whether she had given anyone copies of my documents. She said she had given some documents to a person who was helping her. I asked whether that person had prepared anything. She said she wasn't sure. I asked who it was. She refused to tell me. That was the first time I felt genuinely betrayed by my mother. Not angry, betrayed. There is a difference. Anger makes you want to fight. Betrayal makes you question every old memory. I started wondering whether conversations I had forgotten had meant something different. I started wondering why she had asked about my mortgage years earlier. I started wondering why she had suddenly wanted my documents. I started wondering whether she had been planning this for months. Then something unexpected happened. Ryan called me. He apologized. He told me he had thought the whole thing was simply about moving into the house. He said Mom had made it sound like I was planning to move anyway. That wasn't true. He said she had told him I was thinking about selling. That wasn't true either. He said she had told him that Dad and Mom had helped me buy the house, so they had some moral claim to it. That part was technically true only if you stretched the meaning of moral claim until it became meaningless. Ryan told me he had assumed everything was being done with my knowledge. I asked whether he had signed anything. He said no. I asked whether he had given Mom any money. He said no. I asked what he had been told. He said Mom had told him that once the house was transferred, he would take over the payments. That made no sense. The mortgage was not something he could simply take over. I explained that. He sounded genuinely shocked. For the first time, I realized Ryan might have been manipulated too. That didn't erase his responsibility. He had participated in conversations about my house without talking to me, but he hadn't been secretly plotting to steal it. He had believed a version of the story my mom had given him. We met for coffee the following weekend. It was awkward. Neither of us knew how to talk about what had happened. We had spent years competing in small ways because of the favoritism. I had always been the responsible one. He had always been the difficult one. That dynamic had made us resent each other without either of us admitting it. I told him I wasn't going to give him the house. He said he understood. Then he surprised me by saying he didn't want it anymore. He said he had started looking at apartments. He had also realized that even if I had agreed, taking over a house with a mortgage, property taxes, insurance, repairs, and utilities would probably have destroyed him financially. That conversation was the beginning of things changing between us. Not immediately. We still had a lot of resentment, but at least we were finally talking directly. My dad was different. He barely said anything. I eventually went to see him alone. I asked him whether he knew what Mom had been doing. He admitted he knew she had been looking into ways to help Ryan get the house. I asked whether he knew about the title company. He said he hadn't known the details. I asked whether he agreed with her. He said he thought I should help Ryan somehow. I told him I had already offered to help. He said Mom believed I could afford to give more. I asked him whether he would give Ryan his retirement account if Ryan needed it. He laughed nervously. Then he stopped laughing. I didn't need to say anything else. The problem wasn't that my family believed Ryan deserved help. The problem was that they had decided my sacrifices were easier to make than theirs. That realization changed how I looked at my parents. I had spent my entire life assuming my parents were the neutral ground between me and Ryan. I finally understood they weren't neutral. They had been making decisions based on who they thought needed more, And because I usually handled my own problems, they had stopped seeing my problems as real. The legal side took several more weeks. Mark sent formal notices making it clear that I had not authorized any transfer. The title company backed away from the proposed transaction. My mortgage lender confirmed that no transfer could happen without proper authorization and documentation. I also learned that the preliminary paperwork had included a signature that looked enough like mine to make me uncomfortable. Mark recommended that I document everything and, if necessary, report the suspected forgery. I didn't want to involve the police. That was partly because it was my mother. I kept hoping she hadn't actually signed anything herself. I wanted there to be a person in the middle who had misunderstood instructions. Then Mark found out who that person was. It was someone my mother had met through a financial service. Apparently, this person had been helping her understand ways to rearrange the property. I don't know whether that person fully understood what my mother intended. The paperwork was messy. There were emails. There were notes. There were copies of documents. There was enough evidence to show that my mother had been trying to create a path for Ryan to receive the house. There wasn't enough to prove that she had personally forged every document, but there was enough that I could no longer pretend this had been a misunderstanding. My mom eventually admitted that she had believed she was protecting the family. She said Ryan was drowning. She said I was stable. She said she had watched me build a life and believed I could rebuild somewhere else. She said she never imagined I would feel so betrayed. I told her that was the problem. She had never imagined my feelings because she had never asked. She had decided what I could lose before asking whether I was willing to lose it. She cried. I cried too. I wish I could say that conversation fixed everything. It didn't. Sometimes there isn't a dramatic apology that repairs years of family dynamics. Sometimes people apologize because they are sorry you are hurt, but they still don't fully understand why they were wrong. That was where my mom was. She apologized for how I felt. She struggled to apologize for what she had actually done. I told her I needed distance. For several months, we barely spoke. Thanksgiving was the hardest. I almost skipped it. My dad asked me to come. He said the family needed to try to move forward. I told him moving forward didn't mean pretending nothing happened. He understood. I went anyway. Ryan was there. My mom had made too much food. That was something she always did when she was nervous. The table was crowded. Nobody knew what to talk about. Eventually, Ryan brought up his apartment search. He had found a place he could actually afford. He was working extra hours. He had sold some things he didn't need. He was slowly paying down his credit cards. I was proud of him. I also felt sad that it had taken a crisis for us to become honest with each other. My mom listened quietly. At one point, she said she was glad he was getting back on his feet. Then she looked at me. She didn't ask for anything. That mattered. It was the first time in a long time she had looked at me without expecting me to solve something. Over the next year, things became more normal, not the old normal, a different normal. I kept my house. I continued paying the mortgage. I refinanced later when the numbers made sense for me. I kept every document in a fireproof box. I stopped leaving financial paperwork around the house. I stopped assuming family members automatically had my best interests in mind. That last part was difficult. I had always believed trust meant not needing documentation with family. I learned that documentation isn't an insult. It is simply a record of what everyone agreed to. Ryan eventually paid off one of his credit cards, then another. He got a better position at work. We started talking more often. Sometimes we even laughed about how absurd the entire situation had become. Not because it wasn't serious. It was. But because once enough time passed, we could see how many bad assumptions had stacked on top of each other. He had assumed Mom had spoken to me. Mom had assumed I would agree. Dad had assumed Mom knew what she was doing. I had assumed my family would never cross a line involving property. None of those assumptions were safe. The title company issue eventually disappeared. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There was no judge slamming a gavel. There was no television-style confession. It was mostly paperwork. Emails, phone calls, documents, deadlines, legal notices, people correcting records. That was actually what made the outcome feel real. My lawyer didn't magically defeat anyone. He simply made sure the facts were documented correctly. My deed remained in my name. My mortgage remained my responsibility. The attempted transaction went nowhere. My mother never got the house transferred. Ryan never moved into it. I never had to sue my family. But I also never forgot how close the situation came to becoming something much worse. A few years later, my dad had a health scare. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to make everyone think about wills and estate planning. That process was awkward. My parents met with an estate attorney. They updated their wills. They organized their accounts. They made sure beneficiary designations were current. My mom actually asked me whether I wanted to see the paperwork. I told her I didn't need to. She said she wanted me to know that everything was being handled properly this time. I appreciated that. Not because I trusted the paperwork more than her, because she finally understood why paperwork mattered. Ryan and I eventually helped them clean out their basement. We found another box of old documents. My mom looked at me and immediately said she wasn't taking anything home. We both laughed. It was probably the first time we had been able to joke about the house situation without somebody getting defensive. There was still sadness underneath it. I don't think that ever completely goes away. There are moments when I remember how easily my mom was willing to sacrifice something I had worked years to build. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't received that letter, if I hadn't called Mark, if I had gone to that dinner without knowing anything, if my mom had handed me papers and told me they were routine, if I had signed something because I trusted her. I don't know. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe the transaction would have failed. Maybe someone would have caught it. Maybe I would have discovered everything later. But I don't like thinking about it. The biggest lesson I took from the whole thing wasn't to distrust my family. It was to stop confusing love with surrender. I can love my brother without giving him my house. I can love my mother without allowing her to make financial decisions for me. I can help someone without destroying my own stability. And I can say no without needing to prove that I am a bad person for saying it. For years, I thought being the responsible child meant I had to absorb more bills, more expectations, more patience, more forgiveness, more responsibility. I thought that was just what happened when you were the one who had your life together. Now I think responsibility also means knowing where your responsibility ends. Ryan didn't need my house. He needed to learn how to manage his own life. My mom didn't need to control his future. She needed to trust that he could make changes himself. And I didn't need to sacrifice something I had spent years building just because I was better positioned financially. The strange thing is that my relationship with Ryan improved after all of this. Before the house situation, I had always thought of him as my younger brother who needed rescuing. Afterward, I started seeing him as an adult who had made mistakes and was capable of fixing them. That changed the way I treated him. I stopped lecturing him. He stopped asking me for money. When he needed advice, he asked. When I had an opinion, I gave it without trying to manage his life. We became more like actual brothers. My relationship with my parents never went completely back to what it was before. Maybe that's unavoidable. Trust is weird. You can rebuild it, but you don't rebuild it by pretending the damage never happened. My mom had to earn some trust back. She did that slowly. She respected boundaries. She stopped asking about my finances. She stopped making comments about the value of my house. She never again asked me to sign anything without explaining exactly what it was. Those things seemed small. They weren't. They were how I knew she understood. My dad changed too. He became much more willing to speak up when he disagreed with my mom. I don't think he had intended to hurt me. I think he had spent years avoiding conflict. But avoiding conflict had made him part of the problem. He eventually admitted that to me. He said he had convinced himself that staying quiet kept the family peaceful. He realized later that silence had simply allowed decisions to happen without anyone challenging them. I understood that. I didn't excuse it, but I understood it. The house itself changed too. I renovated the kitchen a couple of years later, nothing extravagant, new cabinets, new flooring, better lighting. I painted the living room. I repaired the fence. I planted a small garden in the backyard. The first time I sat outside after finishing everything, I thought about that night at my parents' dining room table. I remembered my mom telling me Ryan needed the house more than I did. At the time, I had been furious. Years later, I wasn't furious anymore. I was just grateful I had listened to that little feeling in my stomach telling me something wasn't right. I was grateful I had called the lawyer. I was grateful I had kept the documents. I was grateful I hadn't signed anything just to make the argument stop. That last part matters more than I realized. Because when people are emotional, the easiest thing in the world is to sign something just to get everyone to calm down. You tell yourself you can fix it later. You tell yourself your family wouldn't let anything bad happen. You tell yourself you're being difficult. You tell yourself it's only paperwork. I almost fell into that mindset. I didn't because I happened to get a warning before I walked into the room. That warning was a letter. The rest was me deciding to take it seriously. I don't think I did anything extraordinary. I didn't expose some massive criminal organization. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't win a fortune. I just protected what was legally mine, and I let the paperwork speak when everyone else's stories started contradicting each other. The final conversation with my mom about the house happened almost 2 years later. We were sitting in my kitchen. She had come over to help me prepare food for a family birthday. She looked around and mentioned that the house looked different. I said I had been doing some renovations. She nodded. Then she said she was glad I had kept it. That surprised me. I asked her what she meant. She said she had been wrong. She said she had convinced herself that giving the house to Ryan would solve his problems. Instead, she had almost created a much bigger problem for everyone. She said she had confused helping with controlling. That was probably the closest thing to a real apology I ever got. I told her I appreciated hearing it. Then I asked whether she still thought Ryan needed the house more than I did. She smiled sadly. She said no. She said she thought he needed to learn that his life belonged to him. I told her I agreed. That was it. No dramatic reconciliation, no crying, no speech. Just two people finally understanding the same thing. Ryan still doesn't own a house. He rents a modest place. He has savings now. He has a retirement account through work. He is doing fine. He may buy a house someday. If he does, I'll probably help him move. I might even help him paint. But I won't sign my house over to him, and nobody in my family expects me to anymore. The whole situation also changed how I handle money outside my family. I keep copies of everything. I read contracts. I don't sign documents I don't understand. I don't give anyone access to accounts just because they're related to me. I don't assume verbal promises are enough when something has legal consequences. I used to think that kind of caution was cold. Now I think it is respectful. Clear paperwork protects everyone. It protects the person giving something. It protects the person receiving it. And it protects relationships from arguments about who remembers what years later. If there is one thing I would tell someone who finds themselves in a similar situation, it isn't to immediately call the police or hire an expensive lawyer. It is to slow down. Don't sign anything while you're angry. Don't sign anything because someone tells you that refusing makes you selfish. Don't let embarrassment make decisions for you. Ask questions. Read the documents. Get independent advice when property or major money is involved. And don't let the fact that someone is family convince you that normal precautions suddenly don't apply. I learned that the hard way. The funniest part is that my mom originally told me the house was too much for me. She said I didn't need that much space. After all the repairs and renovations, I realized she had been wrong about that too. I did need the space, not because I needed 3 bedrooms, not because I needed the backyard, not because I needed the garage. I needed the feeling of knowing that something I had worked for was actually mine. That mattered to me more than I had understood before. I had spent years believing ownership was mostly financial. It isn't. For me, that house represented every overtime shift, every cheap dinner, every canceled vacation, every weekend spent fixing something instead of going somewhere, every payment that came out of my account when I would have rather spent the money on something else. It represented the first time I had built something that nobody could tell me I didn't deserve. So when my mom told me Ryan needed it more than I did, what hurt wasn't only the idea of losing the house. It was realizing that she had looked at everything I had sacrificed and decided it was available for someone else. I'm not angry about it anymore, but I don't forget it. There's a difference. I also don't think my mom woke up one morning and decided to become some terrible person. I think she got scared about Ryan. I think she saw him struggling. I think she saw me doing okay. I think she convinced herself that the solution was obvious. Then every step after that became easier because she had already decided the outcome. That is how people can cross lines without thinking of themselves as people who cross lines. They start with a justification. Then they find another justification. Then they find paperwork. Then they convince themselves that because the goal is good, the method doesn't matter. I don't think my mom understood how far she had gone until there was a lawyer involved. Maybe that's why her face changed when I told her I had already spoken to one. She suddenly realized that this wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. There were records. There were signatures. There were property laws. There were professionals whose job was to distinguish what people wanted from what they were actually allowed to do. And most importantly, there was a record showing that the house was mine. I think that was the moment the entire plan stopped being an idea and became something she had to answer for. Nothing spectacular happened afterward. That's probably what makes the whole story feel so strange when I think about it. My life didn't explode. I didn't become rich. My brother didn't disappear. My parents didn't cut me out of the family. We just had to live with what had happened. There were uncomfortable holidays. There were conversations that ended early. There were months when I didn't answer my mom's calls immediately. There were awkward apologies. There were financial decisions we handled differently, and slowly things became less painful. That is what I think people don't understand about family conflict. The climax is usually not the end. The argument ends. The paperwork gets filed. The lawyer sends the letter. The person who was wrong gets exposed, and then everybody still has birthdays, people still get sick. Christmas still happens. Groceries still need to be bought. Someone still needs to pick up a cake. Your dad still calls because he needs help with his phone. Your brother still sends you a picture of something stupid he saw at the store. Your mom still asks whether you're coming for dinner. Life keeps going. The real consequence is figuring out how to live with people after you know what they're capable of. I decided I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life punishing my family, but I also wasn't going to pretend the experience didn't change me. I became more careful. I became better at saying no. I became less afraid of disappointing people. Most importantly, I stopped thinking that keeping the peace was always the same thing as doing the right thing. Sometimes keeping the peace just means letting the person who is pushing hardest get what they want. I don't do that anymore. The house is still mine. The mortgage is almost paid down now. I still have the same little backyard, the same garage, the same annoying cabinet that never closes correctly. And every once in a while, when I'm sitting there on a Saturday morning drinking coffee, I think about how close I came to losing it because I was afraid of looking selfish. Then I remember what I told my mom that night. I had already spoken to the lawyer. Her face told me she knew why. At the time, I thought that was the beginning of the fight. Looking back, it was actually the moment I stopped letting everyone else decide what I owed them.